In today's video, we're going to be diving into our upcoming tropical cyclone that is going to be tracking throughout western Florida, bringing impacts over the state of Florida and even for the southeast coast. It has been so long that we have been tracking this one, and finally we're talking about it basically occurring now. What you will see is we do have a cone forecast now finally from the National Hurricane Center, where we get an idea of what their thoughts are. We have a much more expanded spaghetti model plot here from the models later on, and we also will be taking a look at the overall models for the lower 48, so everywhere across the nation basically, and just looking at the overall weather for the next 10 to 15 days. This storm does expect to bring some pretty heavy winds and some severe flooding perhaps. Definitely a whole lot of rainfall. This is going to be a slow mover. We talked about this yesterday, but that is actually an unfortunate fact because, you know, multiple days of heavy rainfall throughout multiple states, as opposed to a quick moving storm where, you know, you only get multiple hours of heavier rainfall. So definitely a much more impactful solution because of that. As we take a look at later on this afternoon, we do see some thunderstorms firing up throughout a lot of the southeast and up into the Ohio Valley and the northeast as well. So some of these areas across here in the east overall. And we've been talking about this for a while now, that we've basically been expecting to see thunderstorms prevailing ahead of this tropical cyclone, which, by the way, is basically located somewhere nearby Cuba in here. Let's go ahead and move things towards tomorrow on Saturday, August 3rd. And as you can see, we have thunderstorms even getting more potent here for a lot of the east. When we look at states like southern Mississippi, southern Alabama, southern Louisiana, all the way from Florida northward to Maine, we're seeing thunderstorms really taking place here throughout these eastern states. A lot of your tropical activity is now nearby western Cuba, or even here just to the west of southern Florida. So somewhere in there is your tropical center, where we're looking at this low pressure that is going to develop here. It is expected to be a tropical depression by this point from the National Hurricane Center. By the time we're looking at Sunday afternoon here, what we see is a clear depiction of a low pressure center trying to take place here, again to the west of Florida. Heavier precipitation not only nearby that low, but also pretty broad throughout the region because of this storm. So this storm is actually bringing about wider impacts, I would say, than what is typical with this type of a storm. We do see throughout the Rockies lots and lots of thunderstorms taking place and showers here throughout these states as well, from the four corner states northward through Wyoming, Idaho, Montana. We're continuing to see these showers prevail. And again, outside of your storm, we're also seeing from Florida to Maine potential thunderstorms here. So just this ongoing very stormy pattern outside of even this tropical system, which is only going to add fuel to that fire, of course. As we head towards Monday on August 5th here, what we're seeing is this tropical cyclone now over kind of the Big Bend of Florida. So some of you corrected me. I call it the armpit of Florida because I know they call that shape in Africa the armpit of Africa. So it's always looked very similar to me to that corner of Africa that they call the armpit of Africa. So that's the reason why I came up with that for the most part. Big Bend, armpit, same idea. Neither are meant as an insult, of course. Again, pretty broad impacts from Florida all the way up through Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina even here. So we're continuing to see a pretty wide area of impacts. The Rockies here, we're seeing thunderstorms from Washington, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico here. All these states seeing some of that monsoon activity, mostly the four corner states, of course, but we do have lower pressure up here in the southwest of Canada that is bringing some of these impacts to the northern Rockies. So this just brings overall storminess up and down this Rocky Mountain range as a whole. It does appear like we have a bit of a frontal boundary here for some of the northern plains, upper Midwest, northeast here, bringing about some thunderstorms and showers for these areas also. So keep that in mind. As we head towards Tuesday on August 6th here, we see that this tropical low pressure center is now offshore of Georgia. So it's basically crossed over the state of Florida here, and it's now off the east coast. And this is when development could get a little crazy. If it stays over open water for an extended period of time here, it could drop, as you know, it could reach hurricane status here off the southeast coast, in my opinion. That is certainly on the table right now. For a lot of the Rockies and Four Corner states, we're obviously continuing to see that activity that we have been seeing. Ohio Valley into the Great Lakes, we're continuing to see some thunderstorms prevailing and showers as well. Same story for the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast also. Now for Wednesday here on the 7th, look at how slow this storm is. It's hardly moved. We do see it down to a 980, 83, 88, something like that. Millibar low pressure center here offshore of South Carolina. And this is continuing to be a impactful system for the coastal regions of Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and it's only getting more intense at this point. Some thunderstorms throughout these mid-Atlantic and southeast areas continuing, but mostly associated with the tropical system by this point. We do see that for a lot of your Rockies and northern plains, we're seeing some thunderstorms and showers continuing for that area as well. Let's keep going, take it towards Thursday. And this European model does basically this. It takes it straight into South Carolina after being offshore of the southeast there for a while as a 989 millibar low pressure center, straight dab in the middle of South Carolina. We do see that this is continuing to bring impacts not only for South Carolina, but North Carolina and Virginia by this point as well, with some outer bands from that storm system. So impacts could be pretty widespread there throughout a pretty large region. From the northern Rockies eastward, we're continuing to see thunderstorms, even in Canada as well here, as you can see through some of these provinces here like Alberta, Saskatchewan, areas like that, seeing these thunderstorms and showers prevailing throughout their plains. We do see that by the time we reach Friday, this tropical system continues kind of westward inland towards northern Georgia, probably still bringing some pretty impactful conditions. Wind should have died down from its peak by this point, but rainfall could still be quite heavy for a lot of these southeast areas, especially in Georgia, if this model is correct, which we're going to make a counter argument here in a little bit for a potential other track. We do see by Saturday here on the 10th, the low has dissipated. We still see the remnants in the form of heavier precipitation staying put in the southeast, so could be a stormy week overall. Also, a lot of your showers and thunderstorms happening here across the northern Rockies and northern plains still, so an active area up there really throughout the next week or so. Sunday the 11th here, these thunderstorms have primarily centered themselves over northern Alabama, southern Tennessee area, and surrounding states there in the deeper south. So still seeing the shock waves of that tropical system bringing major impacts still days later. We do see a low here across south central Canada with a dragging cold front through some of the Midwest and plains. This is going to bring about cooler weather behind it, so for a lot of your northern plains there. And it's going to probably bring pretty strong thunderstorms along that line if this occurs exactly this way. Again, that's Sunday the 11th. Now for Monday the 12th, we don't get a full idea here, but look at the smiley face over Alabama and Tennessee. That is still a pretty impactful system there. Very happy one, but nevertheless impactful over the deeper south. We do see a cold front dragging behind this low that is south of the Hudson Bay with a cold air mass to the north of it, warmer air still taking hold to the south. So that is going to be an interesting air mass to track here. Let's take a look at the GFS model. This is kind of a counter argument. Here is the most up-to-date 12Z GFS model, and it crosses over Florida there closer to the Tampa Bay area. As you can see, it hits Tampa there by the morning hours of Sunday, August 4th, crosses over into Florida, 1003 off the southeast coast, dropping all the way into the 970s, 980s, and 970s there, lower 970s. It gets as low as a 973 there off the shore of North Carolina, mostly southern North Carolina here, bringing very strong impacts, by the way, heavy winds, heavy rain. This would not be a storm to play around with. And it does end up impacting the Outer Banks in southeastern Virginia as well. So hitting these areas actually the hardest on this particular model, where the European model kind of hits this armpit of Africa and then heads back into South Carolina and tracks like this. We see the GFS model, which I'm going to draw in the yellow. It takes a further south route in Florida, more direct route into the Tampa Bay area, and it stays offshore and just heads directly northward up the coast. I will say that this GFS model has been correct throughout this storm so far since we've been tracking it more than the European model, which doesn't mean everything, right? That doesn't mean it's going to continue to be correct without a doubt. It does lean in that direction, but the European model could still take the back end of this storm and be correct. Also, that kind of straight north trajectory is a little bit more common than that very curvy S-curve one. Not to say that we don't see that S-curve occur sometimes. The more straight line approach does occur more times than we see that very curvy approach. So just a couple of things to pay attention to. This does eventually move off the East Coast innocently, but the total precipitation would be impactful to say the least. So let's see what this would look like on this GFS model. If we can get it to load in. There we go. So again, reds is a few inches, browns here being 5 to 10 for a lot of these areas. So basically coastal Georgia, coastal South Carolina, and coastal North Carolina would need to be watching this one very closely for 5 inches plus perhaps. And some of these blues being 10 to 15 inches, so southern North Carolina coastline, and some of the Georgia and South Carolina coastline potentially seeing those very, very high amounts. So already 2 to 5 inches of precipitation is a lot for a tropical system. 5 to 10 is a whole lot. That's obviously a major amount of rainfall and definitely brings almost certain flooding issues. But the blues to purples, where we're looking at 10 inches plus, is catastrophic amounts of rainfall and would bring catastrophic flooding perhaps to certain areas, especially if they're susceptible. Now, the European AI model, let's see which it agrees with. And basically, it takes the side of this I would say middle route. It does curve inland, where the European model, we'll do in the black again just to make things easy here. It kind of does this curve straight through South Carolina and back through there. That's what the European model wants to do. The GFS model does way less of a curve here, hits Tampa, and then continues right up the coast. So there's obviously a big split there in between these, where basically this AI model wants to track. It takes the European model's track and then curves inland a lot further north. So it's a little bit in the middle, leaning more towards the European model, but I'd say that it is further north there like the GFS model. It just has that curve, whereas the GFS model does not. So we do see that this one moves up the east coast from that point, though, and impacts the mid-Atlantic and northeast, as opposed to the deeper south where the European model brings impact. So big difference in where those long-term impacts end up playing out. Now, the total precipitation on this European model, a whole lot for the northern plains and upper Midwest, as we discussed, multiple inches and almost certainly above average amounts. But let's go ahead and zoom in on the southeast and kind of compare here with this tropical system. And again, in this case, we still see those 10-inch plus amounts. It's just for Georgia and South Carolina as opposed to mostly North Carolina. So both models are showing catastrophic flooding being possible here, especially for downtown areas. Susceptible to flooding. This would be a very, very bad news. 10 to 15, even 15 inches plus in the magentas. This does not look good, and both models are calling for it, which is not a good look. Now, the precipitation anomalies, of course, is highly above average up and down the East Coast from this tropical impact, but also the upper Midwest and northern plains from those continuous storms that we see battering this area. Now, your spaghetti model guidance, let's take a look at it. For the most part, we have a pretty good consensus here that looks a lot like something the GFS model was calling for. None of these really calling for what the European model called for. We're seeing a clear path right along that coastline from the west coast of Florida here, straight into Florida here, and then it stays offshore, moving generally northward here through the Outer Banks and very close to the Mid-Atlantic even. So very impactful, especially if it's just slightly more offshore here. It can pick up a lot of steam and can intensify. Even wouldn't surprise me if it stayed over open water longer, could become a very strong tropical storm or even a hurricane. So that is still on the cards as of right now, like I mentioned, and definitely something I'm watching. Regardless of that, the intensity guidance here, I'm going to draw in your tropical storm line and your category 1 hurricane line, a little off, and then category 2 line. We do see that a majority of them are somewhere in between category 1 and tropical storm, with only like 1 or 2 showing this storm not even reaching tropical storm status at this point. And then I would say about 4 showing us reach hurricane status, with 1 even hitting category 2 status here. Definitely an outlier at this point, however. Now, here is your cone forecast from the National Hurricane Center outlook. We do reach tropical depression status by 8 a.m. tomorrow, as you can see. just to the north of Cuba here, as it's expected to track through the Florida Keys, intensifying to a tropical storm at some point between 8 a.m. tomorrow and 8 p.m. tomorrow, remaining at a tropical storm impacting somewhere on that west coast of Florida, and then likely re-entering offshore of this southeast area where they've really widened out the cone, with many possibilities being on the table. But you can see that their center track, where they most expect it to go, is along the lines of the GFS model, which is kind of the worst case scenario at this point. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. We are going to continue to track this storm. I also want to mention that models are starting to eyeball some more tropical cyclones being possible within the next week to 2 weeks, and we're going to start to eyeball those as well here in the video. So this is certainly not over. We're just getting started with what looks to be potentially a historic hurricane season, as conditions are the best that they've ever been for hurricane development, and certainly we're going to be tracking it every single day. So be sure to subscribe. You can even hit the bell icon for daily notifications when we upload so you never miss one. Be sure to like the video if you did enjoy it, leave a comment down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.